My name is Petra. I'm head of developer connections here at Prisma, and I'm super excited to hear from all of you about building data-driven applications.
Thank you, Petra. So my name is Søren, and I'm the founder of Prisma. We've been on this mission for 8 years now to make it easier for developers to build applications with data. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. And as you go and introduce yourself, take a bit of time to talk also about the company you're at, what you're doing, why that's exciting.
My name is Amy Dutton. I am a lead maintainer on the Redwood.js core team. And I am really enjoying working at Redwood, just being able to contribute to open source. And we are using Prisma under the hood. So it's exciting to see those things collide.
Hey, Frederick, founder of GraphBase here. I've been using GraphQL since it almost came out in 2015 and decided to start a company focused on the DX of building and deploying GraphQL APIs. Been doing this for about 2+ years now, and yeah, excited to talk about DX in general, but also, of course, the focus on data.
So I'm Al. I'm head of DevRel at Tinybird. So I've been in the data engineering and architecture space for the past 10 years with a focus on big data, real-time analytics, cybersecurity. So hopefully a bit of a contrasting background with some folks that are looking more at the transactional side. I come from more of an analytics background, but I'm at Tinybird now, and Tinybird is a real-time analytics platform. So it's focusing on the user-facing and application side of analytics.
That's super cool. Before we dive in, I would like to just ask a question right away. Amy, does Redwood have something to do with GraphQL? Does Redwood make it easy to expose a GraphQL API?
I think it does. People complain all the time about GraphQL with their N+1 problems and just trying to, I don't know, whenever I've worked with stuff, it's frustrating because you have to write a query and a mutation and a resolver and then describe your types and do all these things. And it feels so repetitive and mundane and boring as a developer having to rewrite those things over and over again. And so with Redwood, you can write your schema.prisma file, create your model, and then run a migration, and then it will generate those queries and mutations and resolvers for you. Of course, you can modify those, you can expand on them, but it gives you a great starting point so you don't have to worry about a lot of that stuff. And then with the N+1 problem, we also have Redwood Studio, which will help you find a lot of those performance issues that you might be running into.
So Redwood can actually auto-generate all of the code or scaffold the code that you need to create an API based on your database schema. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, it makes it so much easier to work with. And we have tooling also incorporated with Redwood Studio that pulls in like the GraphQL playground. So a lot of times my workflow looks like I create the schema, I generate the code, and then I will play within the playground to generate those queries and mutations, and then just copy and paste that code into a cell. And with Redwood, a cell is something very Redwood-y. It kind of makes Redwood. But what that does is when you're working with React and you're dealing with data, you have to keep track of the state that you're dealing with data. You have to keep track of the loading state, the success state, the failure state, an empty state, and a success state. And so what a cell does is it determines what state you're in. So you don't have to run all those conditionals yourself, especially if you're trying to pull in multiple pieces of data, you're having to do that multiple times. A cell does all of that for you, and then we'll deliver the correct React component based on that state. And so then you're just dumping your queries in and it's delivering that content as you would want it to be. So I found that I can move a lot faster whenever I'm developing because of those tools that Redwood provides, but also because Prisma is running underneath the hood on all that.
Thank you. And then Frederick, just to kind of get us started, maybe you can contrast that to what GraphBase does, because GraphBase also makes it delightfully easy to work with or build a GraphQL API, but it is, I think, very different from Redwood. Maybe you can help us understand.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, Redwood and Prisma is very impressive, but GraphBase, we are only focused on GraphQL, so we have the luxury of just doing one thing and hopefully doing it really well. But we've kind of taken the approach of creating something we call connectors, which is essentially an abstraction over data stores, APIs, and microservices, where you can say, I might have a few hundred microservices that speak REST using OpenAPI. Then you can easily kind of introspect and generate queries, mutations from that. And then you can also customize it, right? So you can transform, shape, as you please, or create custom resolvers if you want to kind of add fields or add custom logic that's not kind of generated for you. So we have a few, like we have Postgres, obviously, and then Mongo, GraphQL, OpenAPI, and then we have a bunch of interesting connectors in the works, but it's a tough prioritization problem I'm sure Prisma has dealt with for many years. But the big thing for us is like we started at the edge, of course, so we've had to deal with a lot of extra problems too, right? So every GraphQL API you deploy with GraphBase, it has a similar DX to Netlify, Vercel, where you start locally and then you can push to production using either the CLI or GitHub, and it will create branches for you, and then it's also deployed to the edge, right? So we sit on top of Cloudflare workers, and every gateway or API is essentially living right next to the user, which sounds great, and it is, but it's a lot of work to get it to compile and be performant, because all the drivers and libraries are not typically meant for that. So
that's really interesting. I think the entire software industry is going through this transition where we used to deploy everything in one place. Maybe it was on-premise, and then we got the regions from AWS, and some of us tried to manage multiple regions. It's very complicated. And now Cloudflare is telling us, don't worry about regions, deploy to the world. It's simpler. From your experience in working with graph-based users and customers, is it simpler? Does it provide a better developer experience?
Well, I mean, first, I think Cloudflare is like super innovative, and like they're moving really fast, and they're trying to reimagine, and of course, compete with the giants of the three clouds. But I would say WebAssembly is for sure in its infancy. I would say after 2 years of doing it, I would say it's not an either or. It's not a binary decision whether you should be at the edge or in a single region or in two regions. I think it depends on what you're doing. So like what we've actually started doing now is offering GraphBase on-prem as well, right? So a managed cloud offering where you can run it in a container, which is like, what are you guys doing? But it's more of in addition to that, you can also have in the same deployment, you can have, the first request, you might do authentication, caching, personalization, anything like that. That makes sense to have close to the user. But anytime you kind of want to talk to your microservices or databases, there's waterfalling involved. So it doesn't make sense for you to go from, let's say, Stockholm to San Francisco 3 times in the same GraphQL request, if that's where your database is. But it does make sense for you to make that first request to maybe say, hey, you don't have access. Okay, I don't need to go all the way back to the West Coast for that. So what we've done now is we have this hybrid approach where you can have the best of both worlds. So that's our kind of learning after 2 years.
So that sounds like a lot of complexity that you need to deal with because you are figuring out how to deploy to the edge. Does that complexity also translate to your users, or can you hide that from your users?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly want to make it really seamless for the user. You shouldn't have to think about all this stuff. Like you just write your schema. We have an SDK, right? So you can write it. Hopefully it's something that's natural to our users, and then quickly go from that idea or use case to production, right? Without spending time on the infrastructure. And that's something we spend a lot of time in. So, but now the new thing that's coming out soon is the ability to say, hey, I want to deploy to the edge. That's the default. But perhaps you can pin it to a region at the edge. Or, hey, I want to deploy this to GCP, Azure, and AWS, and also add edge caching at the edge. So it's figuring that DX out won't be trivial, but it's really powerful.
So it sounds like you're really delivering a lot of power, but also asking the user, the end developer, to understand a lot of different concepts. Al, we've been talking about GraphQL. TinyBird is all about bringing analytical data into applications. Do you have a GraphQL API for that?
We don't. And I'm probably the least qualified here to talk about anything GraphQL. I don't claim to know much about it, so I am listening intently. No, so I mean, we have focused on REST as our way to expose data. So we take a slightly different approach, I guess, in that we are both the data layer. So we are a database for bringing all of the data, doing the analytics, but then also taking it right through to building the REST APIs through to publication. We kind of handle all of that little bit in the middle, right, of doing like the ORM to turn a query into a REST API so that the user can literally write a SQL query, hit a button, get an API, and not have to do any of that bit in the middle. When we think about DX, most of the improvement that we do when we think about it is like our own platform. We sit there thinking about how do we make our own platform, our own tool, our own library have like
Yeah,
super nice DX. But the reality is very few people are working with one tool and one tool only to do what they want to do. And most application stacks are a combination of multiple tools. And that is an area where I think it doesn't get as much attention, right? Because I guess it's a trickier problem to solve because it's potentially lots of external entities, you have less control, but being able to actually improve the DX, not just of your own tool, but of how you work then with other tools as part of a stack, I think is something that, is we need to start thinking about a bit more.
I love that you mentioned that this integration between different companies. In the conversation Petra and I had before, we talked about how it used to be that big organization, they had to build an internal development platform. You have a team building that, and they could build a super tightly integrated platform for their application developers. And these days, you can go and get parts of that platform from companies like yourself, from Prisma, and you don't really get the full platform. So you need to pick a few and then bring them together. And that's really what sparked the idea of creating a category and getting all these companies together to start talking about how does this work well together.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting space as well because you look at some of the promises that were made by like cloud vendors when they say, hey, you just come to a cloud vendor and we've got everything. We've got a tool for that, a tool for that, a tool for that.
Yeah.
And it's all one platform. You don't need to go and buy like 6 different tools and integrate them together. But then the reality is when you actually go and try and use a cloud vendor's native tools for it, you end up picking 6 of their tools. It still feels like you're using 6 different vendors' tools half the time because you still have to put so much work into integrating them all. The cloud vendors tend to not focus on DX really at all. They focus on like powerful features that are very cost effective, but they don't focus on how do we actually push into DX and do that stuff better. And then you actually find that integrating the tools of a cloud vendor tend to be more difficult than integrating the tools from different folks who've actually thought about it a bit more.
That's a really good point because you have other people that have come up like flight control that will then build on top of AWS. And so really it's just an abstraction, but it's that like we need better DX and people aren't necessarily finding that with AWS. So they're creating an entirely separate business just for developer experience.
And I think we see that quite a lot. I mean, like Vercel, for an example. I mean,
Mhm.
who isn't deploying with Vercel these days? And it's not like they've come along and done something like insanely new that nobody's ever thought of before. It's basically they're achieving the same job that everybody's been doing before, but just going, actually, all of those other ways of doing it were basically wrong. And like you start using Vercel and you don't sit there going, oh, I need to figure out how to achieve this job with Vercel. It's you start using it and you go, oh, this is the way to do that job, and all the other ways I was doing it were wrong, right? Which is a really like a change in thinking. It's not I need to learn how to use this tool to do this job. It's this tool does this job.
It used to be that one person on the team would have a side project to build the deployment pipeline to put the static files on S3 or something. And of course, it's janky when it's a side project for one person. And then Vercel and Netlify comes along and say, this is the work of an entire company. So they make it really, really smooth.
And I mean, just to double click on that, like that's exactly what we are tempted to do for backend or APIs, right? Like, why does the front end community get such nice tooling and then you're still sitting there with one staging branch for your whole API and then Elasticsearch is out of sync and then there's no previews for anything. It's just it maybe works, I don't remember, and everyone uses the same API. Why should it be like that? Right.
I agree. I mean, I think the back end space and like particularly as well, like the data space, I mean, has just lagged so far behind in upgrading tooling. Like if you go back 10, 20, 30, 40 years of when data was starting, pretty much all that we have improved is can it scale? Right, is we keep going, we need more data, we need to be able to do queries on bigger amounts of data. Can we make a system that scales better? We've gone from like single user terminals to multi like distributed systems that can handle loads of stuff that have gotten super complex, but the way of working with them is pretty much the same. Like it's never really changed. So they still kind of suck to use, but they scale really well. And it's only in the past, like, I don't know, 5 years, I would say ish, give or take, that we've actually started to go, okay, we like scale maybe it's not a completely solved problem, but I mean, we kind of got there, right? And maybe now one of the bigger problems is it sucks to build this stuff.
When I first discovered Tinybird a couple years ago, what really attracted me to your product is that you are integrating multiple different systems or concerns. It used to be that you would have a big, expensive data warehouse. That yes, you can run really expensive queries, but they're slow, and you really shouldn't run too many of them. You certainly cannot put that in front of your users. So what you have to do is you have to do these background jobs and massage the data and pre-compute and all that mess, and it's a lot of work. And what you're doing is, no, don't do any of that. You can do your queries, and then we'll figure out how to make them fast. Can you talk a bit more about that and how that levels up the developer experience?
If you go back to it, I mean, a lot of systems in the analytics space, right, have been built for a completely different purpose, right? They weren't actually built for applications and user-facing stuff. They've been purpose-built for handling reporting and BI and like big strategic internal stuff, which kind of has a different set of requirements, right? I mean, people don't really care if it takes that 10 minutes to run a report, or if it takes you like a week to actually build the report, because somebody's looking at it once a month, right? So who cares? And they're kind of the tools that we've built for that are fine, right? They're fine. They solve the purpose. And it's now just more recently that we've started to go, well, actually, we're investing like millions of dollars every year and like buying all of this tool just to be able to like store petabytes of data so that we can run a report once a month, or somebody can stick Tableau on it and do a dashboard. And we're starting to realize that actually maybe investing those millions of dollars into doing that is not really worth it. You don't get much of an ROI on that. So what can we do with all of that data that actually generates a bit more revenue? And a lot of that is, well, put it in front of users, like build user-facing applications that use that data, like petabytes and petabytes of it. What can we do to make cool stuff? And it's a different class of problem, right? So it needs a different class of tooling, which takes different approaches to doing things, which does also mean different trade-offs to doing things. So it's like we have like switched focus from what previous tooling has done, which we're not the only ones, right, who have switched focus to try and solve that new problem. There are other people in the space who are also trying to solve that problem. The slightly different approach that we take is that not many people have shifted their thinking away from we've changed what we build, but not how we build it, right? We've shifted from saying, hey, we're going to build these big systems for reporting, but we're still going to build this new class of system as if it was a system for reporting, right? And the way of like developers interacting with it, building with it, and working with it is exactly the same. And it just doesn't work when you're building applications, because applications move so much faster. Users want features like every day. You've got time to market that you actually care about, because there's revenue attached to those features. It's not just when it arrives next month. It's get that feature out now because it's holding up money. It's a change in thought of how we build them. And that's what we're focusing on, right? Of we're as fast and as scalable as the other people working in this space. But the area we're trying to innovate on is DX, right? And how do we actually make developers more productive than they used to be?
So you're taking DX and you're putting it to the top of the priority stack. Are there other things that are falling to the side because of that? Are there trade-offs?
Not really. I mean, the nice model that we've gone for, which I think most people really are going for these days, is basically like the kind of the open core model, right? Where the bit in the middle that we use as the database that powers our platform is ClickHouse, which is an open source database. There's a huge community about it. So we are contributors to it. Loads of other companies, including like Cloudflare that we spoke about earlier, are contributors to it that are helping to build it to be a scalable, performant platform. And so, we don't want to just take from that. We are contributing to it, but we benefit collectively from everybody else's work at the same time, so that we can do some percentage of effort into building performance and scale, but then direct all of the rest of that effort to building DX to help developers.
On the other panel, we talked about the importance of positioning yourself within an existing ecosystem. So GraphBase, you're doing GraphQL. It's a GraphQL ecosystem. If people want to do GraphQL, they can use GraphBase. Tinybird is built on ClickHouse, which is an amazingly powerful analytics database. But I'm not sure application developers want to write ClickHouse queries. And you have a REST API. Are you asking developers to submit ClickHouse queries over REST, or do you have a better way for developers to interact with this?
Yeah, it is a tricky mix, right? Because when you think of particularly back-end developers, quite often they're focused more on code and deployment of things rather than on like writing SQL and doing analytics, writing queries and stuff.
Yeah.
So there is a bit of a mix, right? And we do end up working not just with like backend and application developers, but with data engineering teams, right? Who might own the platform itself and the ingestion and the queries. But the nice thing is that like when you're building data-driven applications, right? You've always got this handoff of you've got some people who own the data bit and you've got some people who own the application bit and the back end bit, and there's a handoff between them, which means you've got a gap in knowledge and transferring the knowledge between the two teams. You've got one team does something and then has got to wait a week for the next team to prioritize it and finish it, whereas we try and get rid of that and say, well, it's all one platform, and basically the data team can write the query from the requirements of the application team, hit a button, get an API, and say it's gone. We don't need to raise a ticket, hand it over, it's done.
So you're facilitating the handover, the collaboration between those two different fractions in the company.
Yeah, basically just trying to find areas of efficiency where you don't need to do as many handovers, right? So it just saves a lot of time.
Jamie, I would like your thoughts on developer experience and this idea of taking that and putting that on the top of the priority list. I feel like Redwood has taken developer experience and put it in the top. And do you see any trade-offs? Are there issues your users are experiencing because of that?
I think developer experience is probably one of your best tools for marketing, because not only does it make things seamless, but then it makes it a pleasure and a delight to actually use something. And so I really appreciate Redwood and some of the opinions that have been made. And I think if anything that has kind of fallen to the wayside is just that we have made strong opinions. And so that makes our developer experience fantastic, but that also means that you have to kind of fall in line with the opinions that we've made. Some of the things that we're working on right now with the next version will open that up a little bit more. So, for example, right now we're very strongly tied to GraphQL. And if you don't want to use GraphQL, you could just use Redwood as a front end layer, or you could use Redwood as just a back end layer. But if you want to use the front end and the back end together, then you have to use GraphQL. But with React Server components and some of the things that we're looking at there, that will be more open and you won't necessarily be tied to GraphQL. So I think that's probably the only thing, is if you don't necessarily want to abide by the opinions and the structure that we've provided, if you want to make those decisions or kind of go off to the side, I think that's the only thing that kind of maybe rubs people, not necessarily the wrong way, but not necessarily like falls in line with what they want to do.
It sounds like what you're describing is the Ruby on Rails philosophy. Like this is how we do it, and you don't need all different ways to achieve the same thing.
Yeah. For me, one of the initial lures to Redwood was that they had made the same decisions that I would have made anyways. And so it was like, well, why not go this direction? Because this is the exact same stack that I would use. But I do understand if you're trying to pull in other things, how that could be more difficult, or if you want to experiment or see how things would work in another ecosystem or try a new technology, then that becomes difficult to do with Redwood as it is right now. But again, as we move forward, that will open up more.
You all have talked a bit about some developer experience principles, basically abstracting away complexity, making decisions easier. What would you all think the most important benefits are to these users who want a better DX? What does good DX look like? What do you find the most important in good DX, and how do you go about that on a day-to-day? What challenges are you solving? What solutions are you liking, especially to make that great DX possible?
I think for us at Redwood, a lot of it is just taking away the monotony. Like I mentioned our code generators earlier, like having to rewrite the same code over and over again, like that's not fun. That's really boring. Or it seems like every application needs some type of CRUD. Like that's really boring. I would rather work on more interesting problems. And a lot of that CRUD stuff can be formulaic. And so why not automate that? So that's been a huge part of our developer experience, is taking those monotonous pieces so that you can focus on more interesting challenges. Another piece is just consistency and naming. I know that sounds silly and dumb, but it makes you have more expected behavior when you're like, I know it's named like this over here, so we should have a similar naming pattern. And it's hilarious in a not funny way how much time we spend in core team meetings just talking about naming things so that that piece is intuitive.
I love that part. What you're basically saying is making decisions is great, but make decisions about the important stuff, and all the other stuff Just have the system take care of it.
Exactly.
And I love that piece on naming consistency, of that it does sound really silly, but it's not until you actually run into a thing where you've got, like 4 different names for one thing that you realize how much time you waste talking about the same thing and then misunderstanding each other.
Part of the reason, I agree, naming consistency is probably the number one thing for me. That's part of the reason why I like GraphQL and we chose it, because it is a standard. We use REST APIs as well, of course. This is not a REST versus GraphQL, but it is nice to have a standard that's widely adopted, that's strongly typed, and documentation is first class. So that's part of the reason we picked it. But the other thing I want to add is also, for us, it's really like time to market, right? Like, how can we help developers move faster by taking away, monotonous things, but also to make them go faster, right? Like, just the feedback cycle of developing a feature, of getting a production PR to production, we think we can help there. And I think that's what really excites me.
So rather than thinking of GraphBase as a backend as a service, is it more appropriate to think of it as a GraphQL API gateway?
Yeah, or a full stack GraphQL platform where everything is serverless and the number one focus is developer experience.
So if you think about how developers are building these data-driven applications, when you think about how someone would get started today, these developer experience improvements probably have a pretty big impact. Do you have any thoughts around how that has changed in the last few years?
There was very little, and Frederick touched on this earlier, right? There was very little workflow around building that kind of stuff. People kind of stuck a database up and then wrote a couple of bit of ad hoc SQLs, and sometimes that would live on people's laptops, and that's where it would stay. And it was quite easy to get lost. And obviously there was no versioning, so you could go and write a data model that would live in your database. And how do you version that? How do you do changes and control that? And I mean, even still today, that's not a solved problem. People are still trying to work that out. But there are more of us now actually trying to look at that problem and start to bring a lot of these software engineering principles that are very common on the front end side and everywhere else in software into the data side of things, so that you can push your data project into Git. You can have an automatic CI/CD process that has got regression tests and everything built into it, and then when you add a PR, it clones everything into a separate environment so that you can run tests on it, and then when you're done, you can just merge the PR, and then automatically behind the scenes it tries to merge that into production. And you kind of think, well, why did we not do that sooner on data? I mean, it's a very, very hard thing to do, particularly when you're doing data at scale, because to be able to test a new model, to be able to test your queries, you need some data to be able to test it against. And if it's very high volume, it's hard to just go and copy that and stick that into a test environment. But I think that's the main thing, particularly for the data backend side, is where it's going to change. And that's something that we've been doing recently in Tinybird, is we've now got basically that flow of being able to connect everything to Git, version it all, do PRs, CI/CD, and all that.
So it sounds like you're talking about preview environments, like we know them from Netlify and Vercel and Heroku before that. Do you have that in Tinybird? How does it work? How do you deal with the fact that there's so much data?
So it's a really tricky one. And the approach we've landed on for now is basically to give the user control. So you can either say, clone all my resources and just here's a static file and load those. Or you can say, go to production and take this slice, this partition of data, and move that across into my test environment. Or, and this is, the dangerous option is take everything from production and copy it in, which if you're at high scale, don't do it. But if if you've got relatively low data rates, then it's kind of fine. That's how we're doing that at the moment, and yet to be seen. It may turn out to be the wrong approach. We don't know. It's just not a solved problem yet, and that's where we've landed so far.
I think another big difference between the last 5-10 years is that composable architecture that we were talking about earlier. For somebody new coming into tech, you have to learn so many different services. And especially if you're trying to build your own stack, you have to make all those decisions yourself. You have to be able to evaluate, should I go REST? Should I go GraphQL? Should I do this or that? And I remember when I was first learning, I would have a tab open for every different type of stack. And I would have to search through the documentation through 6 tabs because I wouldn't be sure what the error was throwing, what service is throwing this error. And so it makes it difficult as a new developer coming in now to be able to keep all of that straight. And in some ways, I think in the past it was a little bit easier because you did have more of a select stack or everything was all encompassing. But as we've tried to specialize on things, it's become a little bit harder sometimes to parse that. But and I think like in most cases, the pendulum will swing one way or the other. People will specialize and then they'll kind of generalize. And I think right now we're kind of in that more specialize, compose, give people options, highlight the user, and let them pick the best service for the best job.
So I talk a bit about this idea that our industry is expanding rapidly, and that means that there's a lot of investment going into it. There are a lot of companies springing up and a lot of stacks appearing, and that's great because there's a lot of innovation, there's improvement to the developer experience. But it's also challenging because it used to be that you had to pick between Ruby on Rails and Python, maybe PHP. Now there's so much, there's so many options. As a new developer, what should you do? What are your recommendations?
They go to the basics. Start with HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and that will get you 90% of the way there because a lot of the other things are built on those or they're going to use them. So even if you are using, say, PHP or Python or Rails, you're still going to use HTML and CSS and JavaScript to do some of those pieces. And also, your knowledge of JavaScript will also help transfer to some of these other languages. The syntax will look different because, for example, there might not be a bracketed language, but at least the way that you think about code and the way that you process and solve problems, that translates regardless of what language or technology you're using.
Frederick, do you have thoughts on how GraphBase is approachable for people new to the field of software development?
Yeah, I mean, it is a good question. It's something we've been discussing a lot lately, especially with this kind of Twitter sphere of React server components where people are kind of questioning, hey, do you need an API? And that's maybe not the first few weeks or months of a project, but eventually you probably will need an API. So it's really interesting to see how we kind of come full circle and people think, oh, finally we can move away from this REST versus GraphQL discussion. But yeah, I mean, I'm more of like going back to the real question is fundamentals. I agree. Like, let's not forget it is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that you are delivering. So it helps to understand what you're doing. But I would say like API first is still a thing. And I think it's really, really powerful to have that from the beginning, just as a mindset for the whole project and team you're building things with. And just this like API economy and if everything is an API internally as you scale, it becomes much easier to manage as well. But also I wanted to address the other thing about what's changed in the last 5-10 years. I would say people are much more kind of willing to adopt managed services today compared to maybe even 5 or 10 years ago. You had to convince a bunch of people like, oh, why? I mean, the cloud is no longer a discussion point, but a managed service, especially for ClickHouse, like no way that would have happened 5 or 10 years ago. Now it's just like, okay, you want real-time dashboards? Okay, what's out there? Tinybird. All right, let's try it. And then in a few weeks, you have it up and running, or maybe even days with a credit card. Like that is revolutionary. That did not exist before. So like starting a company today, I mean, ChatGPT aside, like you can go quite far alone if you know what you're doing. And if you're 2-3 people, you can go so much faster compared to just a few years ago.
So what you're touching on there is that the proliferation of these high-level services, they can deliver so much value with very little effort. And that means even as a new developer, you can go and make use of those services and you can build something meaningful, something that is exciting for you personally, but also something that deliver real value in the real world.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the time to market is dramatically reduced, and also you're spending time on building the product instead of infrastructure. So it's a win-win.
I think that's fascinating because it means that developers can really focus on how they provide value and they can focus on what they want to get done instead of focusing on how to scale this thing, how do I name this thing, which database do I need, how do I do these things that are really just tools for me to get done that application that I want to get out there. If you all think about the developer experience improvements that have been happening and that you might be expecting to happen, how else do you think these data-driven applications will change in the future? What else will these improvements enable for developers?
You're asking us to predict the future.
I think some of the things that are interesting right now is that so many apps are just CRUD based. You're just creating, reading, and updating, deleting data. And in some ways, that's just a glorified Excel sheet. But where it starts to get really interesting and where you need these custom applications is the inferences that you can make from the data. And so, like, it's really interesting to hear what you're talking about with Tinybird and analytics, because all of a sudden, then it's not just data, it's not just a number, but it's like, what does this number mean? And so it'll be interesting to see in the next 5 or 10 years, especially like with Chat GPT, or and I see this even with like Notion AI, where I can ask Notion based on my workspace a question and it will be able to give me that answer. That stuff is really interesting. And, I can see with the rise of AI where that might lead to.
A question for all of you. Are any of you thinking about how to make use of this new AI stuff? Are you building AI into Tinybird or GraphBase? Does Redwood have a take on how you should do vector search or anything like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be wrong for us to not have thought about it and have an opinion. It's an interesting one because a lot of people have jumped onto it very, very quickly and gone, hey, we need to do something with it, and kind of like forced it in, and it's not necessarily always been in a fantastically valuable way. And so we've started to explore, like, given the biggest drawback or downside to AI at the moment is trust, right? It can do some fantastic things, but you can't always 100% trust what it outputs. So,
Yeah.
We've tried to avoid putting it into like mission critical workflows of, you can't just say, go and do this thing, and then it goes out and takes production down. So we've tried to look at ways where you could bring it into areas where if it does something wrong, it doesn't really matter. So earlier in the year, or well, last year I built a like fake data generator, because that's like one of the painful things in data. You try and do a POC, you don't have any data to work with, so you generate some fake data. And then it was, hey, AI is around, and even using a fake data generator, it's kind of annoying to have to configure it. So actually, could you use AI just to configure a fake data generator? And now we have a natural language prompt, so you can say, I'm working on a POC and I want to be able to do some analytics over some financial transactions so that I can build analytics to work out something, right? And you can just type that into a prompt, hit go, and it will try and create a fake schema that says, these are your columns, these are their types, generate some fake data, and then stream it into a table, like as a constant real-time stream, so that you can start prototyping against it. If it messes up, doesn't matter, right? It's not mission critical, but it's a bit of a time saver for prototyping. And then it's, where do we go from there? Like, is it capable yet of being like a data engineering co-pilot? I don't know. I've some people believe so. I'm a bit more cynical on whether it's ready for that yet. It's going to get there.
So is this something that you're already building into the Tinybird product, or is it more of a side project, a hack?
The AI data generator is already in production. It's already like in the product.
Exactly.
You can go and play with it. So it already works. We use it quite a lot for going and testing stuff, particularly, like, as I say, it's like great for like demos or new users that come along and just say, hey, I want to try something out. Or, existing users say, hey, I don't want to load like a CSV of all of my other data because I just want to see if this actually works, like just to prove it in the first place. So it just really lowers that friction to be able to say, hey, actually, is this worth investing into?
We should have that for Prisma. Amy, would that be relevant for Redwood at all if Prisma CLI could auto-generate a data model for you?
Especially when it comes to prototyping and trying to move faster. To go back to your original question about how we're thinking about AI, right now we're just leaning on other services. So Fixie AI is a great service to be able to integrate AI within your application. It helps you do chatbots and things like that. There's also AI JSX, which is part of Fixie. It's really interesting, but we haven't looked at in terms of having AI write code or be a first class citizen inside Redwood.
Speaking of AI writing code, the question I get sometimes is, will there be software developers in the future? Will we still be relevant? Do people need Prisma? The AI is just going to do all of this for us.
Right now, I think you'd still need developers. And the way that I'm using it is more of like a true co-pilot. I am editing code more than I'm necessarily writing code. So GitHub Copilot will make a suggestion, or even I was using GitHub Copilot the other week with Prisma, where I was saying, hey, you can see my data model. This is what I'm trying to get my query to do. What should it look like? And it will generate that for me. And then I can edit it and revise it. But right now it's more of like a sidekick piece. It'll be interesting to see what happens moving forward in the future. But I feel like you almost always need that check to see, did this write what I wanted it to do? Is this the most efficient way? Like, where is it actually pulling that code from? Is the database or the code that it's referencing, is that really the best implementation of what I'm trying to do?
Petra, with that, I think we have a wrap.
Absolutely, I think so. This has been amazing. It was really cool to hear all the insights from all of you and just hear more about the different aspects of what do you think the good DX looks like and these improvements to building data-driven applications.